The auditorium was packed, the air heavy with the hum of cameras and murmurs from political insiders. It wasn't just another panel discussion, it was being billed as the clash between the old guard and the new firebrand. On one side of the stage sat former Vice President Mike Pence, his posture rigid, his expression measured. On the other sat JD Vance, leaning forward slightly, his eyes sharp and restless, radiating the confidence of a man who thrived in confrontation. The moderator had barely finished the first question when Pence seized the moment. He straightened, his voice cool and polished. "With all due respect," Pence said, pausing just long enough for the cameras to catch the seriousness in his tone, "Senator Vance represents enthusiasm, but enthusiasm without discipline is recklessness. And reckless politics don't build nations, they break them." The audience shifted, a few gasps breaking the silence. Pence's words weren't just critique, they were dismissal, wrapped in the authority of decades in Washington. The old guard had spoken, and his intent was clear: JD Vance was too brash, too inexperienced, too raw to lead. For a moment, all eyes turned to Vance. Some expected a stumble, a retreat, or maybe a forced smile. Instead, Vance leaned back in his chair, letting the words linger in the air before replying. His smile was faint but unmistakable, the kind that told the crowd he wasn't rattled in the slightest. "Vice President Pence," Vance began, his voice calm but edged with steel, "if experience means repeating the same mistakes that got us into this mess, then maybe what we need isn't more discipline, it's more courage. Recklessness is watching this country decline while insisting the same old playbook will save it." The crowd erupted. Reporters' pens scratched furiously against notepads. Cameras zoomed in on Pence's tightening jaw, his carefully constructed calm beginning to show cracks. In a single clapback, JD Vance had taken Pence's attempt at condescension and turned it into a battle cry, one that resonated with every person tired of politics as usual. The moderator, sensing the tension, tried to pivot the conversation, but it was too late, the spark had already caught fire. The audience leaned forward, eager to see whether Pence would double down or retreat. Pence cleared his throat, his polished calm returning as he adjusted his tie. "Senator," he said, his tone slow and deliberate, "courage is admirable, but governance isn't about throwing stones at the establishment. It's about steady leadership. That's what built this country, and that's what will preserve it." The line drew polite applause from a handful of audience members, but it lacked the punch of Vance's retort. Pence pressed on, clearly trying to regain ground. "Someday, Senator Vance will learn that passion is no substitute for wisdom. Until then, America needs leaders who know when to act, and when not to." It was a masterclass in veiled dismissal. Pence wasn't just criticizing Vance's approach, he was casting him as an impulsive novice who hadn't earned the right to lead. The weight of decades in Washington gave Pence's words a kind of gravitas that was difficult to ignore. But JD Vance was ready. He leaned forward now, elbows on the table, eyes locked on Pence with the intensity of a man unwilling to bow. "Mr. Vice President," he began, his tone calm but layered with defiance, "you talk about steady leadership as if it's the same thing as safe leadership. But let me tell you, safe leadership is why working families are struggling, why our borders are broken, and why so many Americans feel betrayed by the people in this room." The crowd stirred, some clapping, others nodding in agreement. Vance's voice rose, not in anger but in conviction. "If your version of wisdom means doing nothing while the country slides backward, then I'd rather be reckless in fighting for America than safe in watching it decline." The words landed like a hammer. The audience broke into cheers, their energy washing over the stage. Cameras flashed furiously, capturing the moment Pence's eyes narrowed and his jaw tightened. For the first time that night, it was clear, JD Vance wasn't here to play defense, he was here to seize the stage. The moderator leaned forward, nervously adjusting his papers. He could sense that the debate had shifted from polite sparring into something raw and unpredictable. The room crackled with anticipation. Mike Pence, determined not to let the crowd slip away from him, forced a tight smile. "Senator Vance," he said, his voice smooth but faintly strained, "you sound very passionate, but passion without restraint can burn down the house you claim to protect. I've spent decades serving this country, through crises, wars, and division, and I can tell you that patience and principle matter more than fiery words." It was a reminder of his tenure as vice president, an appeal to legacy and gravitas. Pence's intent was clear: to paint Vance as a rookie, a man too eager to fight and too inexperienced to govern. Vance let the silence stretch, the corner of his mouth curving in the faintest hint of a smile. When he finally spoke, his words were razor-sharp. "Mr. Vice President, with all due respect, Americans didn't elect you to wait patiently while their communities crumbled. They didn't put you in office so you could preach restraint while the border collapsed, while jobs fled overseas, and while families paid the price for Washington's failures." A murmur of agreement rippled through the audience. Cameras flashed, capturing Pence's stiffening posture. Vance's tone hardened. "You call it restraint. I call it paralysis. And paralysis doesn't protect this country, it weakens it." The applause erupted, louder this time, filling the chamber like a wave. Pence shifted uncomfortably, his expression betraying irritation beneath the calm facade. He glanced at the moderator, almost as if to signal for order, but the crowd had made its decision. They wanted to hear more from Vance. Reporters scribbled frantically. Headlines were already writing themselves: "Vance versus Pence, Old Guard meets Defiance." In just a few exchanges, Vance had transformed Pence's attempt at belittlement into a demonstration of strength. The atmosphere inside the hall had shifted completely. What began as a measured debate had transformed into a battlefield of generations and ideologies. Pence sat with his familiar composure, but the tension in his jaw betrayed irritation. JD Vance, on the other hand, looked energized, feeding off the reaction of the crowd like a prizefighter who had just landed a clean punch. Pence leaned toward the microphone, his tone soft but heavy with condescension. "Senator Vance, someday you'll learn that politics isn't about making noise, it's about building consensus. Strong speeches may excite the crowd, but real leadership means compromise, discipline, and respect for tradition. Without those things, you're not leading, you're grandstanding." The words hung in the air like a rebuke from a teacher to a student. The audience grew quiet, sensing Pence was trying to reclaim the narrative. Cameras zoomed in, eager to capture Vance's reaction. Vance didn't rush. He let the silence stretch, his calm demeanor contrasting sharply with Pence's scolding tone. Then, with the precision of a blade, he responded. "Mr. Vice President, consensus is exactly what Washington has been selling the American people for decades, and it's why so many of them have lost faith in this system. Consensus is what gave us broken borders, endless wars, and trade deals that sold out American workers." A ripple of applause broke out, then swelled into full-throated cheers. Vance raised his hands slightly, quieting them before continuing. "You call it compromise. I call it surrender. And if surrender is the price of tradition, then maybe tradition isn't worth protecting." The crowd roared, some rising to their feet. Pence's face remained calm, but his eyes flickered, an unspoken acknowledgement that Vance's words had landed. Reporters typed furiously, their headlines practically writing themselves: "Vance dismantles Pence over consensus politics." The confrontation was no longer about two men, it had become a referendum on the past versus the future. And in that moment, JD Vance embodied the defiance of the future. The hall was buzzing now, the lines between debate and spectacle completely blurred. Pence tried to mask his frustration, but his calm veneer was cracking. He leaned forward, lowering his voice as though confiding in the audience. "Senator Vance," he said, "you speak as though politics is a battlefield. But leadership isn't about crushing opponents, it's about earning respect. And respect isn't won through fiery words, it's earned over time, through service, discipline, and humility. That's something you'll learn, eventually." The words landed like a dagger wrapped in courtesy, an attempt to reduce Vance to the role of an apprentice still waiting for approval from his elders. The crowd shifted uncomfortably, sensing the weight of Pence's experience, but also bracing for what Vance would say next. JD Vance didn't hesitate. He rose slightly from his chair, his hand pressing firmly against the table as he spoke, his voice resonant and clear. "Mr. Vice President, I respect your years of service, but let's be honest, the respect of the American people isn't earned by longevity. It's earned by results. And right now, too many families feel like Washington has given them speeches instead of solutions." The audience erupted into applause. Vance leaned in further, his tone sharpening. "If humility means asking people to keep waiting while their livelihoods vanish, then maybe humility has become an excuse for inaction. And if experience means telling us to trust the same failed system, then maybe experience is exactly what we don't need right now." The crowd roared, some standing, others clapping so hard the sound echoed through the chamber. Reporters scribbled furiously, capturing the duel of words. For the first time, Pence's eyes flickered with genuine unease. His attempt to frame himself as the seasoned teacher had backfired. Instead of looking wise, he now looked out of touch, while JD Vance radiated the conviction of someone unwilling to be belittled. The air inside the hall was electric, every exchange sharpening the divide between Pence's calm authority and Vance's raw defiance. The moderator tried to regain control, but both men had seized the stage, one defending his legacy, the other writing his own. Pence leaned back slightly, a faint smile tugging at his lips as though amused by Vance's fervor. His tone was gentle, almost paternal. "Senator, someday you'll understand that politics isn't about winning the loudest applause. It's about stability. I've stood in rooms with world leaders, negotiated matters of life and death. Trust me when I say, experience will teach you the difference between passion and prudence." The audience murmured. Pence's words were smooth, carefully crafted to remind everyone of his status and gravitas. To many, it sounded like the seasoned wisdom of a veteran, to others, it dripped with condescension. JD Vance waited for the murmurs to fade. Then he leaned toward the microphone, his voice steady but edged with fire. "Mr. Vice President, I respect your experience. But if that experience means telling people to wait while Washington dithers, then maybe it's not wisdom at all, it's complacency. Families don't have the luxury of waiting for Washington to learn prudence. Their bills are due today. Their communities are crumbling now." The crowd erupted again, louder than before. Vance pressed on, his hand cutting through the air. "You call it prudence. I call it delay. And delay is killing the very people who trusted us to act." The roar of the audience filled the chamber, drowning out the moderator's attempts to interject. Reporters hammered at their keyboards, knowing the duel had shifted once more in Vance's favor. Pence's smile faltered. For the first time, the calm mask cracked, and behind it was something else, frustration, even a hint of anger. It was becoming clear, the more Pence tried to shrink JD Vance with reminders of experience, the larger Vance appeared in the eyes of the crowd. The lights from the cameras glared hotter as the back and forth grew sharper. This was no longer a debate, it had become a duel. Pence adjusted his notes, his jaw tight, but his voice calm, almost icy. "Senator Vance, firebrand speeches might thrill a crowd, but leadership requires humility. You're not running a rally, you're representing a nation. And nations fall when leaders mistake showmanship for statesmanship." The words were measured, but the sting was clear. Pence wanted to reframe Vance as a mere entertainer, not a leader. Some in the audience nodded, familiar with Pence's reputation for controlled discipline. But JD Vance didn't flinch. He leaned forward, his voice carrying the sharpness of a blade wrapped in conviction. "Mr. Vice President, I agree, this isn't a rally. It's a reckoning. And what America is reckoning with is decades of polished speeches that led to broken promises. You call it statesmanship. I call it theater. And the American people are done paying the price for a show that never delivers. The crowd erupted. Cheers and applause filled the air, drowning out the gavel as the moderator tried to call for order. The energy shifted fully in Vance's favor. He was no longer just answering Pence, he was channeling the frustration of the audience itself. Pence's calm mask cracked, ever so slightly. His lips pressed into a thin line as his eyes narrowed. He had meant to make Vance look small, but instead, Vance's words echoed like thunder in the chamber. Reporters scribbled furiously, capturing the shift. Headlines were already being formed. Vance turns Pence's rebuke into rallying cry. And as the crowd's energy swelled, one thing became clear: Pence's attempt to belittle had only elevated JD Vance higher than ever. The moderator, beads of sweat forming on his forehead, tapped the gavel harder. "Gentlemen, let's bring this back to policy," but the crowd wasn't listening anymore. Their focus was locked on the two men at center stage, fire against ice. Pence leaned in, his voice quieter but sharper, carrying a weight meant to wound. "Senator Vance, anger may win you applause today, but history doesn't remember anger, it remembers restraint. Leaders who last are those who think before they leap. I fear, Senator, that you're still leaping without looking." The line drew some murmurs of approval from Pence's allies in the audience, but the majority leaned forward, waiting for Vance's inevitable response. The camera zoomed in, Pence with his tight, practiced composure, Vance with the unmistakable glint of defiance in his eyes. Vance didn't hesitate. His voice cut through the noise, louder, firmer. "Mr. Vice President, history doesn't remember the ones who stayed quiet. It remembers the ones who acted when it mattered most." "Anger?" He gestured toward the crowd. "This isn't anger, it's urgency. It's the sound of Americans who are tired of waiting for Washington to restrain itself while their lives are torn apart." The crowd erupted into cheers, some chanting Vance's name. Flashbulbs from the press lit the stage like a thunderstorm. Vance pressed on, his voice rising with conviction. "You say I leap without looking? I say Washington looks without leaping. And that hesitation has cost this nation more than any so-called recklessness ever could." The room shook with applause. Pence's jaw tightened, his fingers tapping nervously against the desk. For the first time, his aura of unshakable control looked fragile, like glass beginning to crack. This was no longer just about Vance defending himself, it was about exposing Pence as a relic of politics past. The chamber felt like it was teetering on the edge of eruption. The moderator's voice was drowned out, the cameras whirred relentlessly, and the audience seemed glued to the collision unfolding before them. Pence, once the embodiment of composure, now leaned forward with a faint edge of desperation. "Senator Vance," Pence said, his tone clipped, "you speak like the world will bend to your will. But governing isn't about force, it's about trust. And right now, you're not building trust. You're tearing it apart. You don't win people over by shouting them down." The words were meant to sting, to remind the crowd that Vance was young, fiery, maybe even reckless. Pence's voice, though calm, carried the unmistakable sharpness of someone fighting to hold ground. Vance didn't flinch. He looked Pence squarely in the eye, his expression steady, his voice powerful. "Mr. Vice President, trust isn't built by asking people to wait while their problems get worse. Trust isn't earned by telling families who can't pay their bills that Washington needs more time to think it over. Trust is built when leaders act, when they fight for the people who sent them here." The audience broke into thunderous applause, chants of "Vance! Vance!" rising like a wave. Pence's face tightened, his eyes darting toward the cameras. Vance rose slightly from his chair, leaning into the microphone, his voice cutting through the cheers. "You say I'm tearing trust apart. But the truth is, trust was broken long before I got here, broken by leaders who talked about principles while delivering excuses. If fighting to restore that trust makes me loud, then I'll be loud enough for every American to hear." The room exploded. Some stood, clapping and cheering, others shouted approval. The clash had reached its peak, two men, one representing the old guard, the other the fiery new wave, locked in a showdown that would echo beyond this hall. The hall thundered with applause, chants echoing against the marble walls. The moderator gave up trying to restore order. This was no longer his debate to manage. It was history unfolding live, raw and unscripted. Mike Pence, his jaw set tight, raised his hand for quiet. When the noise subsided slightly, he spoke with a calmness that carried a hint of weariness. "Senator Vance, I admire your energy. But America doesn't need fire, it needs light. Light that guides, not flames that consume. If you truly want to lead, you'll have to learn that difference." It was Pence's final attempt to wrap the confrontation in dignity, to appear the seasoned statesman above the fray. Some applauded politely, but the energy in the room had already shifted far beyond him. JD Vance rose fully now, no longer content to remain seated. His presence dominated the stage. His voice, steady yet ringing with conviction, cut through the air. "Mr. Vice President, light without fire is nothing but a flicker, and America cannot survive on flickers. What we need is courage strong enough to burn away the excuses, the paralysis, and the endless waiting that has betrayed working families for decades." The audience exploded, stomping feet and clapping until the chamber shook. Vance lifted his hand slightly, commanding silence. His tone softened, carrying the weight of authenticity. "You say I must learn, sir. But maybe Washington has forgotten what it means to listen, to the farmers, the workers, the families who don't have the luxury of patience. They don't need another lesson in restraint. They need leaders who will fight like their lives depend on it, because they do." The ovation was deafening, some rising to their feet, others chanting Vance's name. Pence sat silently, his face composed but his silence louder than any retort. For everyone in the room, the verdict was clear: Pence had come to diminish JD Vance. Instead, Vance had risen taller, sharper, and more commanding than ever. The clapback hadn't just shocked the room, it had shifted the balance of power.